I see the crystal raindrops fall, and the beauty of it all is when the sun comes shining through to make those rainbows in my mind when I think of you sometime, and I want to spend some time with you, just the two of us.
A big thing that the CCP deal with straight away, or try to, is opium use and the opium trade and prostitution. Apparently, according to the accounts, both opium use and trade and prostitution was just massively rife, really bad, sort of really destroying the fabric of society in the cities especially. Or in the south, I think opium was being used as just currency. Because of this Chinese civil war that had just come to an end, Chinese money, the currency, was almost worthless. And especially in the south, people would just trade and barter in opium. Anyway, the CCP come in and with a jackboot, and they just executed any dealer that they could get their hands on. Just thousands of them shot in the back of the head.
It's like what's happening in the Philippines now.
Yeah, a similar thing, but on a much larger scale. Yeah, if you were an opium user, they tried to re-educate you. It's just cold turkey, basically. But if you're a dealer, and the bigger dealer you were, the more they went after you. It was a real war on them. And I've read that in about 2 years' time, opium dealing and use had been almost cut off.
I imagine they weren't strictly following like the rule of law in doing this.
No, no.
They were probably kicking down a lot of doors and shooting a lot of people, right?
Yeah, yeah. And with the prostitutes, it was a slower thing, but they did curb it. It was part of the women's issue, they called it. And they had like a women's association that would go out and try and save these women. And I mean, that's a good thing. I mean,
well, I'm sure some people benefit.
Nothing wrong with that, yeah. But and although it was slower, apparently it was, you know, massively curbed within a few years, a handful of years. But the scale of the problems that Mao and the communists had when they took over was overwhelming. They couldn't deal with it themselves entirely. It was just impossible. So they had to look for outside help. But on the international scene, America was just pro-GMD and anti-CCP, anti-Mao.
And by now considered China lost, right, when it fell to Mao. Yeah,
well, it caused a huge worry in America, in Washington.
One of the main reasons for the Red Scare.
Yeah, well, the Cold War really ratcheted up at that point. They saw, you know, people like McCarthy or even the president. There were loads of people, most people in America, it seems, the media, everyone just saw China going red as just now it's a single giant block of the Russians and the Chinese. It's like a quarter of the world has just turned communists, boom, overnight.
It's true and not true.
Yeah, exactly, true and not true. The Mao... Well, we'll get into this in a minute when I go on to it, but the relationship between the Chinese and the Russians was always fraught, and by sort of 1960 was completely dead. But it suited America to see them as a single block way after 1960.
Well, I think they had every reason to fear that as well, because Mao would have, like, although he didn't get like full support from the Soviets, still did intend to cooperate with them.
I'll talk about that now. No, I'll talk about that now. So on the international scene, America and Europe and all the big players in the West all supported the Republicans, and so the only option Mao really had was the Soviets. And he called it, famously, leaning to one side. We must lean to one side. A lot of Mao's government, I've read, is government by slogan. They would always have these slogans. And, a lot of the pervading winds can be sort of deciphered from the slogans of the day.
And they usually sound really uncatchy.
Oh yeah, but they're in translation to us, that's the thing. I have heard about slogans that they're always better in Chinese.
Makes sense. Different alphabet.
Yeah, you know, like the Great Leap Forward is one of these slogans, you know.
Okay.
So he would lean to one side, meaning the Soviet side. Now, Mao's relationship with Russia had always been a bit weird. From 1927 onwards, he was basically in their pay. To a degree. Him and the CCP were taking money from Russia.
Well, and were they the Chinese, the Comintern's choice for China at that point?
Not
always before, right?
No, they were, Okay. So, but what had happened is Stalin had always backed Chiang Kai-shek, right up to the last days almost. he'd backed him, and remember, he'd sort of forced Mao to work with and collaborate with Chiang Kai-shek earlier, like in the 30s. So, in other words, Mao had been burnt by Stalin loads of times, like badly. So Mao was rightly, obviously, really wary of Stalin. And although he had to lean to one side, he wasn't happy about it, particularly. And from Stalin's point of view, he didn't want a sort of independent thinking, proud communist state of court of the earth's population right on his borders. He'd had Tito, who hadn't been completely subservient to him, hadn't towed the line, hadn't taken orders directly from the Kremlin. And that's a problem.
Broke from the Soviet
From Stalin's point of view. That's not cool. So he's wary of someone like Mao. Indeed, he calls him a caveman Marxist at one point. He said his writings were feudal. Even though Stalin himself was a peasant, basically, from a really, really poor, not rural, but he wasn't from a truly urban background, and he was really poor kid. But even he looked down on Mao as like an illiterate peasant. He wasn't illiterate, but he looked down on him as just like an unlettered peasant. Well, Mao paused outside Beijing when he conquered it in 1949. Because he was, well, sort of afraid, for want of a better word, of the workers, that his peasant army and the workers might clash. It didn't really happen in the end, but Stalin, when Stalin heard that, he said, he was meant to have said something along the lines of, what sort of communist, what sort of Marxist is afraid of workers? So they both held each other with suspicion and almost contempt, if you like.
Rivalry.
Yeah. So when Mao gets in, he's finally invited to go to Russia, to go to Moscow. He's asked to go to Moscow many times in the past, and they've sort of poo-pooed him. For example, throughout the whole of World War II, the only thing he ever got from the Soviets was apparently one plane load of propaganda literature. So finally, when he actually gets power and proclaims the People's Republic, it's sort of Stalin's 70th birthday later that year, and he invites Mao to go there. Mao takes sort of a 10-day train journey, one of only 2 times he ever leaves China in his whole life. And the other time is to go to Russia, again, later in the 50s. Yeah, so he's not a well-travelled man. And so, as I mentioned, it was Stalin's 70th birthday celebrations. Mao's just one of loads of delegates there from sort of the communist world, and he's treated as that, just another one of the delegates. And he's put up in one of those villas at Dasha, just outside Moscow, and he's left there for weeks. He's there for 9 weeks in total, and a few of those weeks are just left waiting for an audience with Stalin. Stalin doesn't meet him, doesn't give him an audience right away or anything. And that's a proper snub, isn't it? If you know anything about Stalin, that's going to be deliberate. Mao actually visits Leningrad at one point, and he says that he's, quote, seen great achievements of the workers there. So he gets to see a little bit of Russia. And the great things, because of course Moscow is, quite a wonderful city in some ways, quite awe-inspiring. You've got the Hermitage and the Kremlin and loads of golden treasures to see.
Magnificent architecture and stuff.
Yeah, and to come from that little valley that he comes from, to be there, was, I think, quite something.
Obviously, he's seen Beijing.
Yeah, he's no longer like a green, wet behind the ears. No, but still.
But Moscow is going to be one of the more impressive cities of Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's one of the most impressive cities in the world. And there's a big military parade for Stalin's 70th birthday bash. That's going to be quite impressive to Mao.
Vast army now.
Yeah. Well, the Red Army is still mobilised, more or less. So eventually, Stalin does have an audience with Mao, but they've got fairly huge ideological differences, and are just suspicious of each other, don't like each other, and Mao goes away with sort of the bare minimum, which was it's quite a lot still, a promise that the Soviets would defend communist China against any sort of American aggression, and a little bit of aid, a few hundreds of millions of dollars effectively in aid, which is like nothing basically. The books I've read say that was just like a token.
Right.
It still went a long way in China, but it was basically hardly anything. And Mao has to give away. It's like the old days of getting screwed over by the Western powers, the century of humiliation. He has to give away loads of stuff, like loads of lands that the Russians wanted or currently had. They get to keep, and just loads of other things where China's just disadvantaged. But yeah, Mao comes away with that. And life settles down. He settles down as the ruler of China in Beijing. Him and the sort of really, really upper super elite of the party settle down in a place called Zhongonghai. I'm probably saying that wrong. I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways. But Zhongonghai is like the place within Beijing, within the old sort of imperial city, that they take sort of luxurious apartments there, compounds all next to each other. Yeah, he settles down there with his wife, Zhang Qing. And he's got his daughter by her, who's sort of growing up now. She goes to university in Beijing, doing history. And he's got one of his sons, his firstborn son, sort of around a bit. And they sort of settle down into sort of quite a nice little set of surroundings. Mao likes spicy food. He loves spicy food. He says if it's not spicy, it's not revolutionary. That must have been tongue-in-cheek. It must have been. He would like... sort of bet people if they could keep up with him spicy-wise, dare them to eat what he's eating. Sort of.
Do you like Sichuan food? That's supposed to be really spicy.
I don't know, is that in the south?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because he's from the south, and I've heard it said just it's like southern spicy food. Or
full of chilies.
Yeah, chilies, yeah. When he gets older and has health problems, his doctors ask him to stop eating chili so much, and he doesn't. He loves to smoke. He always used to love 555s, which is a British brand. But after he gets into power, he changes to some Chinese brand, Panda or something. But he's a heavy smoker, apparently. And he wears, when he's at liberty to wear whatever he wants, he walks around naked or half naked most of the time. Usually with just a towel around his waist or a night robe or a dressing gown. And even when he died, they found in his wardrobe just old shitty clothes, like old kind of peasant style. He never wore extravagant things. He never adorned himself in jewels or anything like that. And yeah, he didn't like shoes. He'd only ever wear leather shoes when he had to for like formal occasions and stuff. Go around bare feet most of the time. And his personal hygiene was bad. He'd never brush his teeth. There's a thing they would do where you just chew tea leaves, leaves from a tea plant. Apparently, if you chew that, it sort of freshens your breath slightly. But obviously, it's not going to clean your teeth. Get crap out from between your teeth. So and it's this point he starts to get fat, really. When you see images or footage of Mao proclaiming the People's Republic in 1949, he's sort of halfway between the old fat Mao and the young sort of svelte Mao. Right. And it's when he sort of settles down in Zhongonghai that he starts to really get fat. And and he sleeps around. It's sort of open that he cheats on his wife, and they sort of have fairly soon sort of kind of separate apartments, separate lives almost. Yeah, his extramarital affairs are sort of fairly open. He doesn't ever like smush it in her face like the Duke of Wellington did to his wife or anything, but it's sort of just known. One of the sort of first great things that the CCP do, a communist promise to destroy the landowning class. So that's what they set about doing. I mean, I've heard it said that the peasantry thought that under communism they would get a fair shake. They would be able to have their own bit of land now, rather than just be under a landlord. Probably actually oppressive landlord. But that's not what the communists had in mind. That all land would belong to the party or the state, and the peasants would just work on it.
Collective farms.
Well, ultimately, yeah. I mean, that's sort of the end game. But you don't jump straight to that. I mean, even Mao couldn't just jump straight to that. But, they did start straight away the destruction of the landlord caste by, just state appropriations and murders, basically.
And don't they incite the peasants to attack the landlord?
Oh, it's the peasants that do it, yeah. Sort of guided by or goaded on by sort of a party delegate.
Yeah,
it'll be the peasants themselves that it's settling old scores a lot of the time, yeah.
They'll get the most fervent of the peasants to attack them, and they'll give them the green light.
Exactly. Yeah, well, the idea of giving them the green light or not. I mean, when it became clear that there was just hundreds of thousands of landlords getting murdered or just beaten up and dispossessed, and Mao had to sort of say something explicit on the matter, he reiterated the old line that revolution isn't a tea party, which is essentially a green light. I mean, if that's all you say, then yeah. Or he also said early on that something along the lines of that, extreme leftist elements are out of control or something, but
conveniently.
But ... Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They just don't. The Mao and the communists just don't want a bourgeoisie anymore. And within a few years, not too long, they have more or less destroyed the land-owning class one way or another. They have people's tribunal sessions or struggle sessions. Where the peasants humiliate and murder their landlords en masse across the country, huge country.
Something like 1 million people.
Well, the numbers no one knows. I heard like 700,000, but it's just silly. It's hundreds of thousands, yeah. Oh yeah, Mao called it ultra-leftist deviations had been responsible. But the revolution is not a dinner party. And of course, in 1950, the Korean War kicks off, another big thing that Mao has to sort of deal with straight away.
With the permission of Stalin.
Well, I hadn't really realised to what extent Stalin was driving the Korean War. Most documentaries you watch about it or books you read about it don't really stress that enough, I feel.
Kim Il-sung apparently was pushing for it as soon as the war... Well, from soon after the war ended.
World War II?
Yeah, right, and he was waiting for Stalin's permission, and Stalin finally gave it him.
Yeah, well, Kim Il-sung was a complete Soviet,
agent.
Yeah, basically, yeah. He didn't even know Korean, the language, I don't think.
Oh, he'd lived
Well, he could barely speak it. I think he could speak it a bit, but he
lived in Russia most of his life.
He could barely speak it, and he'd hardly ever been there. Yeah, he was a total Soviet mole. But yeah, the Korean War kicks off. Yeah, one of the slogans is "Resist America." Just simply that. Some even it's called like the "Resist America" period, even, or the full slogan might more have been "Resist America, Aid Korea," and he would talk about our Korean cousins or our Korean brothers.
But China didn't send troops in until
later, yeah, well, loads of troops anyway.
51, was it? It was when the Americans were approaching.
It was when they'd crushed the North Koreans, yeah, right up to the North Korean-Chinese border. They pushed, basically.
Suddenly.
Yeah. And think about it from Mao's point of view. The Americans or the UN had pushed all the way up to your border and destroyed a communist state or a fledgling revolutionary movement on that you were pro. It's not that paranoid to see it as maybe a prelude to an invasion of China. And of course MacArthur
said
wanted to do that. And, for a few days or weeks or whatever before he was dismissed by Truman, it might not have been completely clear America or the UN wasn't gonna do that. I wasn't thinking seriously about that.
Yeah.
So anyway, Mao said at this point, quote, that the Chinese are to join our Korean comrades in their fight against the invaders and to strive for a glorious victory. Repel the attacks of the American imperialists and their running dogs. End quote. I think the running dogs might be the British. I think we were the main, I don't know, but we were the main other party actually giving men and tanks and artillery pieces to that war other than America. I mean, America was the vast majority of it, but we had a fair few regiments out there getting stuck in. Actually, Mao's oldest son, On Ing, I'm probably saying his name wrong, On Ing, is killed. Mao's eldest son is actually killed in Korea. He was in the army, and the command post or something he was in was just hit by an American incendiary shell or an incendiary bomb, and he was annihilated. And Mao says openly that, that it's terrible that we must all, including myself, give the lives of our children for the greater good, but it's something that must be done. He put a brave face on it, but apparently behind the scenes he was actually quite devastated by it, at least for a while. And as I mentioned, Stalin dies in 1953, and the armistice is sort of agreed fairly soon after. And, that puts a full stop on it for me, the idea that it was Stalin's will that was driving that forward. I mean, it wasn't Mao, in other words, because the negotiations over when the Korean War ended took a long time. Long time. A couple of years, whatever. And they were still fighting each other, sort of, on and off. And it wasn't Mao drawing that out. Not personally, anyway. Oh, I got a quote from the historian Frank Dicotta, on Mao's relationship with Stalin. He says, quote, "For 30 years, Mao had suffered humiliation at the hands of Stalin, willingly subordinating himself to Moscow out of sheer strategic necessity. The Korean War had made him even more resentful of the Soviet Union's patronage, a feeling widely shared by his fellow leaders who likewise craved a sense of equality in their country's dealings with Moscow." End quote. So Mao wasn't one of those people that was taken in by Stalin in any way, like Roosevelt, and to some degree Churchill. But, you know, Stalin dies in 1953, and you've got a sort of everyone, the whole world really, had to deal with the ghost of Stalin, you know. And Khrushchev gets in eventually, and they have to deal with, you know, they have a period of de-Stalinisation, don't they? There's like the de-Stalin period. It's a 2 or 3 years after, but they have to go through that.
Which Mao deplored.
Yeah, so Mao saw any criticism of Stalin as a criticism of him in a way. Mao still defended Stalin, at least lukewarm, for the rest of his life.
He considered him still a true communist.
Yeah,
whereas Khrushchev brought about like a right-wing deviation, he would probably see it.
Yeah, Mao, well, we're jumping ahead, but yeah, Mao talked of Soviet revisionism.
Yeah. So then that was bad, in a bad way. Is now with Mao in his eyes.
Yeah, oh yeah, well, we'll get onto that in a minute, but yeah, he saw himself after Stalin's death as the main communist of the world. The fulcrum around which the communist world will pivot. That's not my line. I can't remember where I heard that or read that, but so, well, that involves a struggle of sorts with Khrushchev, because he would have considered himself, or the rest of the communist world does consider the Soviet leader as the main leader of any international movement.
And at this point, they were right to think that.
Yeah. It takes years to come to a head, but I mean, right off the bat, Khrushchev and Mao. Well, Mao doesn't really like Khrushchev at all, straight off the bat. Khrushchev is himself a peasant as well, and was apparently quite brash and coarse.
And a bit reckless.
Yeah.
In the way he did things.
But also, I think the more I hear and read and understand about Khrushchev, I think a lot of it was a Columbo act.
Okay.
I really do. You know, like he's pretending to be a bumbling, brash idiot.
But sometimes was.
Sometimes may well have been, yeah. But was very ambitious and very conniving and
obviously
clever.
Intelligent to get to where he did.
Yeah. I mean, he got to where he did. The reason he wasn't killed by any of the Stalinist purges was because he was Stalin's total lapdog, apparently. Like, absolute, like, one story I heard, Stalin tapped his pipe on Khrushchev's forehead in front of people and said, "Here's my little Marxist dog," or something. Or no, tapped him on the head and said, "It's hollow," meaning his head, in front of people. So that, you know, paints a picture of, but when Khrushchev gets in himself, he's an operator. He knows what he's doing. He's no fool. So I think a lot of it might have been a bit of a Columbo act, if you like. But Mao just sees him as, well, holds him in contempt, really. But can't sort of make that clear right away. He does eventually make that clear years later. And Khrushchev is happy to give China and Mao loads of aid. As I mentioned, Stalin had been really begrudging with anything like that. Khrushchev like lavishes money on them so much that the Soviets can't really afford it, just giving them just loads and loads and loads of help and money. And
sending technicians.
Yeah, just whole turnkey operations, whole factories and things to get things done. Mao really wants the bomb, but they won't give him that. But Mao sets his own Chinese scientists working on it pretty hard anyway. That's one of the things the Soviets just don't ever actually give him. At one point, I think they say they're going to, but they never do.
Well, Khrushchev didn't he keep telling him, well, you're under our umbrella anyway. So
Yeah. I've given you like a defensive pact where we will nuke your enemies, and if needs be, what more do you want? Something. But
and Mao's like, no, we're one of the greats. Like, we should have the bomb ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I sympathise more with Khrushchev there.
Yeah, well, I don't want any more countries than need to have the... Well, it would be ideal if none of them had it.
Yeah.